Hello and welcome to A-Level Ancient History at Godalming College. My name is Jonathan Sparshott and I am one of the three teachers who teach Ancient History at college, my two colleagues being Ruth Nixon and Alex Winfrow. Ancient History is also part of the wider History and Politics department at college, meaning that it enjoys being part of one of the largest and most successful departments in the college. This video is going to give you a brief overview of the structure of the course, the units of study, and also to give you a sense of the nature of how we work in the subject and some of the key topics we'll be looking at in more detail. To begin with, the first thing to say is that no prior knowledge of ancient history or classical civilization is required to take the course, and our starting assumption is that you have not looked at these periods before you begin. Having said that, the four areas that we look at across the 2 years of the A-level course are these. So we begin in the first year by looking at 2 period studies designed to give you a broad span of the ancient Greek world and also looking at the early years of the Roman Empire. So the first topic we look at is entitled Relations between Greek states and non-Greek states, and then the second topic is the Julio-Claudian emperors, the first dynasty of Roman emperors. In the second year, you will then move on to look at 2 depth studies which focus on more specific areas or times and are designed to go into more detail into those areas. So the first of these being the politics and the culture of Athens in the 5th century BC alongside ruling Roman Britain. All of those are weighted equally and they are assessed via 2 exams at the end of the second year, one assessing the Roman units and one assessing the Greek units combined. So moving on to these areas individually, the Greek period study that you'll be looking at in your first year is entitled Relations between Greek states and non-Greek states between 492 and 404 BC. Now this topic, this unit looks at, to begin with, a conflict known as the Persian Wars, and we understand how this group of Greek city-states, because at this time there is no single Greek nation, there is no single Greek people, but instead a collection of over 1,000 Greek city-states, how and why these Greek city-states found themselves at war with the local superpower of the day, the Persian Empire, and how the Greek states who fought against Persia remarkably in the end managed to win. We move on from that to then look at one individual city-state, perhaps the most famous, which is Athens, and we understand how this state became the dominant power in the Greek world. But then this leads to our second major conflict of the period, looking at the Peloponnesian War, which is a conflict between Athens and its allies and its great rival and enemy Sparta and its allies. And we understand the cause of that conflict, the course of that conflict, and then its eventual end with the defeat of Athens. A nice way to think about this unit is that it's sort of the international relations of the ancient world. We understand how states get on with each other, sometimes through peace treaties, sometimes through the connection of individual leaders, but also at times by fighting and going to war. Alongside this, in your first year, you'd also look at the Roman period study called the Julio-Claudian emperors from 31 BC to AD 68. Now, the Julio-Claudians are the first dynasty of Roman emperors. Before them, Rome is technically a republic ruled by a limited selection of the people. The Julio-Claudians are the first family to take control and to become emperors. So we look at how they became emperors, we look at how they managed to rule an empire that covered most of the known world in its day, how they also dealt with the powerful groups in the city of Rome itself, people like the Senate, people like the plebeians, the ordinary Romans. And we also look at them as individuals, what their characters were like, what their rules were like, their reigns. And the 5 emperors who make up the Julio-Claudians are these ones: Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, who's also known as Caligula, Claudius and Nero. And some of those names have sort of descended through history as some of the best rulers ever known, but also some of the most tyrannical and unpleasant rulers in history. So these are a complicated bunch of people. This is a complex family that has its highs and its lows. Moving on then to the second year, once we've looked at our 2 period studies, we then begin to look at 2 depth studies where we will engage in a bit more detail and we will also look in smaller time frames. So the first of these is the Greek depth study. And we focus here on the politics and the culture of Athens, so a city-state we're familiar with from the first year, but we now focus on it in the period 460 to 399 BC, when Athens is meant to be having its golden age. It's meant to be at the peak of its power and a flourishing city-state. So within this unit, we look at its democracy and society. This is the birthplace of democracy. We look at this new wave of thinking and ideas that came to Athens at this time, including some of the most famous philosophers ever known, people like Socrates. We look at its art and architecture, some of the greatest buildings that have ever been built, like the Parthenon. We look at the sculpture, the design of these buildings, and what purpose they held. We think also about another form of art, which is the tragedy and the comedy, the drama that is performed in Athens, which is incredibly important for the political life of the city, but also binds Athenians together, lets them deal with the difficult issues of the day. And lastly, we also think about the nature of Athenian religion, what the Athenians thought about their gods, how the gods interacted with them, and how they celebrated this through very, very important festivals through the year. And the really good thing about the Greek depth study is that it builds very nicely on the knowledge you will have gained in your first year through the period study. So you've already learnt the background to this, and now we're drilling down into one particular city-state in much more detail. So that it combines the first and the second year really nicely together. And lastly, the last topic that you'll study in the second year alongside the Greek depth study is the Roman depth study, called Ruling Roman Britain from AD 43 to circa around 128. Now, this focuses on one distant province of the Roman Empire, which the Romans called Britannia. And Britannia was not important to the Romans. It was not a priority. It was not an area they looked to conquer, particularly until AD 43. So we try to understand through archaeological sources, through written sources, why first of all the Romans invaded, why did they bother, how then they maintained control through military means, but also more subtle, more clever means as well, and then how the British tribes reacted, because again there is no single Britain at this point. There's a collection of dozens of tribes who are used to being at war with each other. So how did they react to the Roman invasion? Well, sometimes peacefully by cooperating with the Romans, but sometimes violently by resisting as well. And lastly, we think about the impact that the Romans had on Britain, the economic impact, the social impact. How did they change the country, the province that they took control of? And this is really a topic, I think, where you will fine-tune your source handling skills. We do a lot of reading and analysing primary sources in ancient history, and this is where your skills will be really polished on this topic, and we'll look at, alongside written sources, the physical remains of the Romans in Britain, and we'll look at archaeological sites like Hadrian's Wall and also Fishbourne Palace. So those are our 4 units of study. That makes up the complete A-level ancient history. And I'm just now going to give you a case study in each of them, a sense of what you might look at and how you might study in each of those 4 topics. So beginning on the Greek period study, going back to the beginning, one of the key events we study here is the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Now, if you've not heard of this before, this is one of the most amazing against the odds victories in world history. A Persian force 3 times the size of its Greek enemy lands 26.2 miles away from Athens at a place called Marathon, confident of victory, but they are remarkably defeated by a much smaller Athenian force. This is considered to be one of the most pivotal moments in world history. Most historians think if the Persians had won at Marathon, then the whole course of Western history changes from that point. We understand the events of the battle, we look at the tactics, the military strategy, we also look at the leaders, the famous Athenian leader Miltiades in this victory too. And we do this by reading the accounts of the father of history, someone called Herodotus, who's credited with inventing the whole world, the whole idea of history. And he himself is a fascinating character. He's detailed, he's accurate, but he also likes to mingle in with his work the gods, myths, rumour into his work as well. His work is really exciting to read. He tells a brilliant story, but our job as a historian is to try and decipher what's true and what is not true. On the Roman side of the course, we'll be looking at this key event of the Great Fire of Rome during the reign of Nero in AD 64. So in AD 64, a large part of Rome, a city of 1 million people, burns to the ground, and it sparks one of the great historical mysteries. Does Nero start the fire because he wants to create real estate? He wants land to build a palace on. Does he watch the fire singing and playing his lyre because he's so delighted by it? Does he blame the fire on this new sect of Christians and use them as human torches as revenge? Once again, to answer these questions, we look at the different accounts, and there are about 3 competing accounts from historians, some there, some writing later, and we try to compare them and work out what we believe and what we think is made up and why. Moving on to the Greek period study, I've already mentioned this, but we will focus in detail to give you a sense of the range of what we study on the building of the Parthenon, the largest temple in the Greek world when it is constructed. And it is one of the most spectacular buildings ever built. It is huge. It is designed to to celebrate the goddess Athena, but it's also the most amazing work of mathematics and symmetry as well. It's full, for example, of optical refinements that make it look perfectly designed. It makes it look like it's just right angles everywhere, when in reality there isn't a right angle on the building. All of the pillars lean in slightly to give you the illusion of it being perfect. There's lots and lots of these different tricks, all of which were carried out in an age that doesn't have calculators and doesn't have computing power. So we understand how this is built. We understand also why the Athenians went to such lengths to construct this. We look at the frieze that surrounds the inner wall. We look at the sculptures on the front and the rear of the Parthenon and what they are meant to show. And we also look at the statue within it, the 12-metre high gold statue of the goddess Athena, which was meant to have cost more than the temple itself. And lastly, on the Roman depth study, we look at the Boudiccan revolt. So in AD 60-61, the queen of the Iceni tribe, Boudica, revolts against the Roman occupation of Britain, and it's one of the most famous events in British history. Boudica is one of the most famous women in British history. There is a statue of her outside the Houses of Parliament. However, we know very, very little about her. We only have a few records from Roman writers who don't like women. We only have one description of how she looks. We don't really know how to pronounce her name, and we don't know where her final battle against the Romans took place. So our job is to try and work out what is true again and why has she become this national figure. Within all of that, though, we understand that Boudica comes very, very close to toppling Roman power in Britain. So once again, we use the physical sources, the written sources, to try and unpick that mystery. Okay, that is the outline of the course. That's also hopefully given you a taste of some of the topics we study and how we will look at them. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in the future very soon.